Well, good evening, everybody. What is your weather weakness? Let me give you a brief introduction of who I am. My name is Scott Denstead. I'm a CFI and former National Weather Service meteorologist. I'm also EA's subject matter expert on weather. So if you're an EAA member, I've done several webinars with them. So just sign in and go to their webinars portal, and you'll be able to also view those as well. And I'm also the founder of one of the newest aviation weather applications out there called Easy Weather Brief. That's easywxbrief.com. And I'm also the co-author of the newest weather book out there for pilots called Pilot Weather from Solo to Airlines, and co-authored by Doug Morris, who is a Boeing 787 captain for Air Canada. Okay, so tonight we're going to cover two weaknesses. I'm going to limit it to two simply because I want to cover each one in some depth. And they include convection connection. I know we're moving out of the warm season into the cool season, but there's still a lot of places around the country that are dealing with pretty significant areas of convection. And the next one is what is called non-convective low-level wind shear. So we have a convective and a non-convective element. So let's first of all talk about convection. So what is the most significant weather threat for summertime flying? Think about that a second, and I'll give you a hint. It's not thunderstorms. I know most folks were thinking thunderstorms. So we know that thunderstorms are dangerous, and certainly during the summertime, spring and fall, we deal with convection and thunderstorms all the time. But I want to make a point that it doesn't take a full-blown thunderstorm to ruin your day. So I like to focus pilots on a basic concept of minimizing your exposure to deep, moist convection. Deep, moist convection. If I could remove the term thunderstorm from the vocabulary of pilots, I would do that, because we really shouldn't be worried about whether lightning occurs or not. It's really a matter of dealing with this concept of deep, moist convection. Now, I'm sure you've seen this image or something very similar on the various different websites out there of the thunderstorm life cycle. This comes from the Aviation Weather Advisory Circular 00-06B. This was revised in 2016. And so this particular image that you see is not incorrect, but it leaves a lot to, in terms of understanding the threat to pilots, it leaves a lot of information out. So it shows you the towering cumulus stage on the left, the mature stage in the middle, and the dissipating stage on the right. And for the most part, you're drawn to the attention of that mature stage when in fact, that's not the stage that's going to kill you in an airplane when it comes to convection. It's actually the towering cumulus stage that is probably the least understood or at least appreciated by pilots. And that's the stage that I'm going to focus on today. So I've been asked in the past to define what a thunderstorm is. Give me a definition of a thunderstorm. And as easy as that sounds to answer, it actually was pretty difficult to find a really, really good answer to that question. And I finally found it from the National Severe Storms Lab. And they define a thunderstorm as a rain shower during which you hear thunder. Since thunder comes from lightning, all thunderstorms have lightning. And I know I've done this in the past with other groups, and I usually hear chuckles in the audience when I show that, but this is actually a pretty darn accurate depiction, and it's very appropriate from a pilot's perspective. The key words here are a rain shower. And we'll talk about that next. So just like we saw in the image from the Aviation Weather Advisory Circular, all thunderstorms begin in the towering cumulus stage, and that's really kind of the next stage beyond that is when you start to get precipitation falling before any lightning strikes, and we call that a rain shower. And I know a lot of pilots kind of have told me in the past, well, it's just some little spritz, some showery precip, no big deal. But it is a big deal. We know that not all rain showers grow up to be thunderstorms. So the rain shower, again, is just the beginning of the convective process. So why do you care? Well, would you fly into this supercell thunderstorm? So I took this picture. This was called a mesoscale convective system, and it had a supercell relation to it. I was moving away from this area, but nevertheless, I'm not going to make a right turn and turn into this supercell thunderstorm, period. Not going to do it. I know all of you would not do that either. Why? Because it looks threatening. It's flat out ugly looking. We would not necessarily go into that because we see it, it's there. We just wouldn't go there. That's a suicide mission. So let's look at the results of just a simple little rain shower. So this particular bonanza ended up in extreme turbulence while in instrument meteorological conditions at 7,000 feet. And if you notice, the pilot side window is shattered. And the pilot doesn't know whether or not that was because of the flexing of the airframe, whether his head hit the side window or something else flew out of the cockpit and hit the window. Doesn't know why. But this will certainly get your attention. The pilot turned out that they were able to recover about 1,200 feet above the ground, slightly on its back and spiraling down. Fortunately, this particular pilot had some PITS experience, was able to recover. And of course, after something like this, it's time to put the airplane down and figure out just what happened. And so they were able to divert to a small airport. So here's the flight-aware flight path from Poplar Grove up in kind of north central Illinois. He was headed down to Tennessee. And you see there were a little diversion to I-96 after the event. And so what you see here, on this particular NEXRAD mosaic, this was about the time that they were passing through kind of by the Louisville area, and that arrow that you see is the kind of the direction or route of flight. But what you notice here, and it's real important to notice, is that you have a cellular appearance to the NEXRAD image. You see cells here and there scattered out through an area. And that cellular pattern tells you you've got a convective process in place. None of these are thunderstorms, not even close, really. These are rain showers. And it turns out that none of these are expected to ever become thunderstorms either. And if you looked at the Louisville terminal forecast here, what you would see is that the forecast was for VCSH. That's showers in the vicinity. Again, the word showers comes up in the forecast. And so in this particular case, you see the red circle there. That was the cell that was problematic in this particular incident. And we'll look at the loop of this in just a second, but essentially, this was not what was on the iPad. This particular pilot had ADS-B or FISB in the cockpit, but most likely, as the pilot was working through this area where you see that red circle, that's the likely picture, a light area of precipitation that would have been seen by the pilot on their data link weather. And now I'm showing you kind of the arrow there again is the flight path, and you can see where that blue area that we saw initially develops and essentially makes its way through until this kind of these roads are intersecting. That's essentially where that particular pilot ended up in extreme turbulence in IMC. So this little rain shower, again, there was not lightning in there. Can't call it a thunderstorm. But what you do notice is a rapid development from essentially not much in the way of significant returns to something fairly significant. So that implies a pretty strong updraft. Over a 10 to 15 minute period, you go from literally having almost no returns to something that is fairly significant, up there in the 45, 50 dBz level. And as a result of that, that's what ended up taking this pilot and turning them upside down. So again, this was a part of this could have been the delay in FISB, although as I talked to the pilot, that really wasn't the case per se. They entered into IMC and hit this developing cell, and that's what essentially caused the issue. So you might say, well, what was the forecast along this route of flight? And if you look here, you have from Illinois all the way down into Tennessee. This is all white for the convective outlook that was valid close to the time of departure. And it's not in any area where you see the possibility of a forecast for thunderstorms. So the way to read this is anywhere you see the color, and basically the color is defined by being to the right side of this arrow, Anywhere you see color, there's a 10% or greater chance of thunderstorms that occur in the valid period. And this covers a pretty wide range of time as well. So from a thunderstorm standpoint, there wasn't much in the way of thunderstorms expected here. And if you look at the surface analysis chart, what you see is a kind of a big area of high pressure. There's the frontal system that's off the coast almost, and the flight is all behind the frontal system. So therefore, you have little or no in the convective outlook, less than 10% chance. And then certainly you're in a high pressure, which you normally think is a good thing with respect to flying. But you're missing part of the problem. If you're only focused on what's happening at the surface, you're really not going to understand what is driving this particular convection on this day. And that is looking at the upper level charts. So we know that with every area of low pressure and frontal system, there usually is some upper level trough that essentially comes in behind the weather system. So we know that the surface depiction you see there on the right is at the surface, but at the same time, there is still significant energy in the atmosphere to produce weather even behind that front. And so the left side here is the 500 millibar chart, which is roughly 18,000 feet up. We call that the waistline or belly button of the atmosphere. And that has yet to pass through the route of flight. So essentially, this trough is colder air being aloft, being pulled down to the south. That's what the trough is. And as a result of that, you have fairly warm ground. There's places here 84, 75 degrees, some fairly warm air with cold air aloft produces a lot of instability. So those showers that you see are all driven by instability and this upper level trough, which adds some outside energy contribution or lift to that particular process. So essentially, this pilot ended up flying into what is called low-topped deep moist convection that had no lightning associated with it. So go back to that supercell thunderstorm picture. That's something you would not want to fly into, but this scenario doesn't look all that threatening. And as a result of that, it lures you into thinking it's safe when it's not. So that's the element that is of concern. So extreme convective turbulence is associated with this little rain shower. Again, it draws you in thinking it's safe when it's really not. And it's important to never, ever stop doing weather analysis. When you close the door on the cockpit to depart, your weather analysis needs to continue. You need to keep your mind engaged in what's happening weather-wise. And even more so because now you're up there in the weather, you want to continue to understand what's going on around you. And for some folks, it seems like as soon as they launch, that weather analysis can stop or become very limited. The problem is, in this particular case, is that when you're flying at 7,000, 4,000, 5,000, or 6,000 feet, you're really missing what's happening. So I think for this case, this particular pilot was kind of compromised down low. Now, this is not specifically images taken by the pilot per se. This is for a flight that I was taking, and I was trying to fly at 5,000 or 6,000 feet, when I noticed on the left, I saw some precipitation. Again, none of this was thunderstorms per se. And you can see kind of in the upper right corner, you do see some kind of buildups and cumuliform clouds, but it's very easy to have flown into this, not really seeing what's going on. Instead, I had to kind of climb up to 10 or 12,000 feet. And then that's the picture I see on the right, which gives me a clear indication of vertically developed clouds. Again, no lightning. There's no thunderstorm here, but it shows the enemy that's ahead of me. And so I chose not to engage in that particular area and go around it. And I think for this pilot, they got into IMC pretty early in this process and ended up kind of in the middle of that updraft of that cell that was developing, probably looking pretty similar to what you see here. And again, none of these tops are really much above about 25,000 feet. And as a result of that, the pilot ended up wandering into something that maybe they thought was pretty benign, which turned out to be almost something that could kill them. Again, beware of the benign. So the moral of the story is a forecast for showers is a forecast for convection. No matter how you look at this, anytime you see a forecast for showers, I don't care if it's with your local broadcaster or reading a forecast discussion or looking at the terminal forecast when we see showers in the vicinity or rain showers, you immediately need to think convection. This is the way forecasters tell you about that first of the three stages of a thunderstorm. And so I usually focus pilots on also reading the area forecast discussion. So it's okay to look at the terminal forecast, but if you're not looking and reading through the forecast discussion, you're really missing half the information. Now, some discussions are more useful than others, but this is where the forecaster has a chance to tell his or her side of the story, to show how they are quantifying uncertainty. And in this case, this is not associated with this particular event, but this was in my area in Charlotte at one point where it says scattered showers and perhaps a thunderstorm are expected across the North Carolina Piedmont from the afternoon till early evening and will carry VCSH for now to cover that threat. VCSH to cover that threat. That's the forecaster is telling you that this is an uncertain thunderstorm event, but they're going to throw showers in the vicinity as a way of covering the threat of convection. And forecasters believe that pilots understand this, and I know for a fact that most do not. So essentially, that showery precip becomes a placeholder for a low confidence thunderstorm event. Okay, so now we'll switch our attention to non-convective low-level wind shear. So we talked about convection, now we're going to talk about something that's non-convective. And I know this term is not very familiar to most pilots. The term low-level wind shear is probably, but the terms non-convective low-level wind shear are probably not. And most pilots, most instructors, most examiners that I talk to don't understand what this is. So I want to explain that. So I usually ask folks in a situation, is this forecast that you see in a TAF for non-convective low-level wind shear a forecast for severe turbulence, WS020/19055 KT. So the WS stands for wind shear. And inevitably I get most, 2/3 or 3/4 of the audience to raise their hand and say, yes, it is. It's got to be. It's wind shear, so it's got to be turbulent. Well, that's not true. This is not a forecast for turbulence whatsoever, but there's a scenario I want you to avoid, which I'll talk about towards the end. So let's talk about just in general, what is wind shear? Well, wind shear is defined as a marked change in wind speed and or wind direction over some distance or altitude. So you have here on the left, you can see this is a kind of a horizontal wind shear difference. So the length of these arrows is kind of basically telling you about the difference in speed, but you also see the direction potentially change as well. And you can see the same thing in the vertical. So you have this vertical depiction here where, again, the length of the arrow is the speed of the wind, and of course the arrow is pointing in the direction, so you can have speed and directional change. So those are the two combinations that you typically have with respect to wind shear. And when it happens down low, we call that low-level wind shear. There are two basic types of low-level wind shear: convective and, of course, non-convective. So convective wind shear is associated with, well, you guessed it, convection. So if you look at a TAF, for instance, and try to pick out when you could have convective low-level wind shear, what you're typically going to see is that the timing is typically going to be in the afternoon. Not always. It can be happening in overnight hours too, but much of that happens during the afternoon hours in many places around the country. You're also going to typically see very strong gusty winds. And then you're going to see either rain showers or thunderstorms in the vicinity, or heavy rain and thunderstorms as part of that forecast. So in that forecast, I would expect to see convective low-level wind shear. But what is this non-convective low-level wind shear? Well, first of all, it has nothing to do with convection at all. When you interpret this exactly as it's stated, this basically says that the winds at 2,000 feet above the ground, because this is forecast essentially at an airport in a TAF, are 190 degrees true at 55 knots. That's all it says literally. This is not a forecast for turbulence. It just tells you the wind direction and speed at some altitude above the ground. And for TAFs, essentially, it's 2,000 feet is the highest this wind shear layer can occur, or that could be WS015 or even WS005 for 500 feet. But it kind of describes what's called vertical speed shear. It implies the winds are rapidly increasing with height in that wind shear layer. So it looks sort of like this. So at the surface, you have maybe 5 knots or so. Could be even winds calm. And as you go up in the atmosphere, the winds rapidly increase with height. Now, it doesn't tell you whether or not the winds change direction. That can happen as well. All it tells you simply is that the winds are rapidly increasing with height. And so you might think, well, if the winds are rapidly increasing with height, and you think about, like, say, a tumbleweed, and the wind blows across the ground and the tumbleweed tumbles because of the stronger winds and the resistance. So you think there's going to be some kind of circulation in that. And certainly that's a good approximation to what most people will tell you, that there's got to be some rotational aspect of having that situation occur. But the catalyst behind non-convective low-level wind shear is a temperature inversion. You see this in the SKU-T diagram here. You see the rapid wind increase with height going from somewhere at the surface around, maybe in this case around 20 knots or so, all the way up to as high as 80 knots here. And this particular inversion that exists near the surface is kind of the reason why this non-convective low-level wind shear occurs. And so what you might think is that you get that kind of tumbleweed approach here. And in fact, the stability of a temperature inversion, you go back to your education of learning about stability, instability. Instability, air wants to rise or descend easily. But when you have stable conditions, air doesn't want to move up or down. It wants to stay in the same location. So if you perturbed air up or down in a temperature inversion, it's going to want to resist any movement at all. And so when you're looking at this, those circulations per se that you think exists won't happen, because as soon as air wants to rise up, it's immediately squashed and pushed back down. Or the other way, if air tries to go down, it's basically pushed back up. Stable conditions inhibit mixing in the atmosphere and therefore inhibit the potential for turbulence. So this non-convective low-level wind shear basically is what we call, in this particular case, we separate the surface friction, use the word decouple, from the atmosphere aloft. And I'll give you an example that may make a little more sense. If anybody has ever watched the Mythbusters, I think it was Adam Savage was given the job of swimming across a pool. And they timed him, and he swam across the pool, and they timed his swim, and then they let him rest a little bit. But the next time, they put some kind of compressor at the bottom of the pool with a lot of bubbles that produced a significant amount of bubbles, and asked him to swim across that pool in those bubbles. And he couldn't do it. It was very difficult because it was interrupting his ability to be able to move easily through, in this case, the water. Same thing happens in the atmosphere. As you get thermals on a hot day where you have unstable conditions, it tends to slow the prevailing wind down quite a bit. You remove those thermals, remove that mixing, and what you end up with is laminar flow. And the air just above the surface is free to accelerate unencumbered by surface friction. In fact, this non-convective low-level wind shear happens at night a lot of times. So next time you're up on a kind of clear day at nighttime, take note of the ground speed a couple thousand feet above the ground. I think you'll notice that there's actually a pretty strong river of air flowing over the ground, even though at the surface, it might be pretty calm. I took a trip once from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, down to San Angelo in Texas with an instrument student. And as we were essentially flying down there, we took all day to get there, and it was at nighttime. And I think we were going into Abilene potentially, and called the tower, and the tower said, it was like 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night, you're make a right base, the runway, whatever, you're cleared to land, wind's calm. Normally that's a case where you think, wow, okay, wind's calm, fantastic, I'll be able to grease this landing with no problem. And we made the right base, and as soon as we turned to the right, all of a sudden what we saw is the ground speed, well, at least I did, saw the ground speed drop by 50 knots. I mean, we hadn't really powered back a whole lot, but the ground speed dropped by 50 knots. It seemed like we were getting further away, this was in a Cirrus SR-20, further away from the airport than we are getting closer. And it wasn't until we got down to about 500 feet above the ground that we actually, at that point in time, our ground speed picked up, but it was smooth as can be, actually eerily smooth. And again, that's all non-convective low-level wind shear that occurs almost all the time nocturnally, and we may not even notice it because it doesn't produce bumps. So when we see this non-convective low-level wind shear, in most cases, it's going to be pretty smooth because of that low-level temperature inversion. So it turns out that non-convective low-level wind shear has two different flavors, a frontal and a nocturnal, as I just suggested. So frontal can basically happen at any time. So if you're looking at the TAF, for instance, and you see the forecast for non-convective low-level wind shear at the end there, it can happen any time or day or night. And the winds can be all over the place. They can be nearly calm, variable at the surface. They can be fairly strong sometimes. Usually you'll have clouds and maybe even some precipitation associated with it. But that's kind of how it looks with respect to a frontal-based low-level wind shear. And it tends to occur just south of the warm front. But nocturnal non-convective low-level wind shear, again, happens in the overnight hours, as you can see, with generally lighter winds at the surface. Again, it could be even calm. And usually you're dealing with either clear skies or scattered or even few clouds. And depending on the wind shear magnitude, it can be up pretty significant, up there at 55 knots. But one of the things that you want to make sure you understand and avoid in these cases is when you have a high magnitude, when we're seeing the numbers go up there in the 55, 65, 75 knot range, and it's in the presence of moderate or heavy rain showers or even thunderstorms. That's when it's time to think twice about challenging this for a couple of reasons. First of all, these kind of high magnitude winds show you've got a pretty powerful weather system moving through. And you might say, well, how can you get convective rain showers and non-convective occurring at the same time? It can happen. And it usually, again, happens because you have either some kind of low-level inversion or something that's not necessarily, in this case, it's we call isothermal, meaning the temperature doesn't change with height. That's still very stable air happening near the surface, but a lot of instability trapped aloft. When that happens, you can get both rain showers and non-convective low-level wind shear together. And so what happens essentially, and we look back here real quick, that's a 75 knot wind just 2,000 feet above the ground. And in this particular situation, let me go back to this. When I was living in the Baltimore area, I had a student of mine who flew a Cardinal, and he just loved to go out anytime we got any kind of significant IFR events, like to go out and do some instrument approaches. He wanted us, a CFI along, and I would go out with him. And Larry called me up one day and he said, Scott, he said, tomorrow looks like a pretty good day for IFR. There's going to be some weather moving in. You want to go out and shoot some approaches? And I said, well, Larry, I'll get back to you. I'll take a look at the weather and I'll let you know. And so I called him back up and said, Larry, I think we're going to forego this. In fact, this was the forecast I had seen. I think I'm going to forego this time. He said, well, what's going on? He says, there's this non-convective low-level wind shear up at 75 knots. He said, well, Scott, you taught me that this is a non-event. And I said, well, yeah, but in the presence of heavy rain showers, not going to be a good thing. And so here's essentially what's happening is you get this 75 knot wind a couple thousand feet above the ground. And as you can see in the background there, you have that heavy rain kind of falling through that 75 knot wind. And that tends to translate the transfer of the momentum of that 75 knot wind in those rain showers straight down. And it will essentially overcome that temperature inversion or that lower lapse rate and essentially become microbursts. And sure enough, the very next day, early in the morning, I was sitting at my desk writing an article or something, and all of a sudden, it just went pitch black. I mean, it literally was like somebody blotted out the sun. And so the weather geek that I am went running to the window and opened the shades and looked. And sure enough, I could see heavy rain falling, and the pine trees in my backyard were kind of going back and forth. They weren't bent over, they were just sort of waving back and forth. And then all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I saw my kid's trampoline lift up, levitate, if you will, spinning around pretty rapidly, not falling over. And then it eventually, after about 10, 15 seconds of that, plopped itself down about 10 feet away. Pretty amazing to watch that all happen in real time. And I had an anemometer on the top of my roof of my house, of course, went running to that display, looked, did not see any indication whatsoever of any gusts. That was essentially a pretty benign microburst, but nevertheless a microburst that occurred due to that straight down projection of that 75 knot wind. And I would have not wanted to be flying an instrument approach trying to land in that situation. So again, this is something you definitely want to avoid when you couple these two things together. All right, one last point, and we'll take a few questions. And that is, you really have to manage the big picture. Understanding the big picture is really important here. Anytime you're looking at the weather, really just bubble back out, think big picture. I know that's really hard for most pilots to do, but I would challenge you on doing that. So we see that there's this terrible accident where this pickup truck managed to find itself on the other side of the guardrail. And certainly there's a lot of details here you can kind of pick out and kind of figure out maybe what went on. But if you really want to see what happened, the big picture is the thing that rules the kingdom. So this particular person really lucked out. They're certainly dying in that particular situation. So again, the big picture is real important here. All right, so my website again is easywxbrief.com. I offer a 14-day trial. And you can reach me at support@easywxbrief.com if you want to send me an email.